He is the Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand. He attacked Guy and Espiner for greedy journalists wanting tax cuts for themselves and therefore driving the debate, which, when you consider the salaries of TV and Z journalists, could quite possibly be true. He has also run one of the most successful economic periods in New Zealand's modern history. But why is Labour dying in the polls? Tonight, we talk to Dr. Michael Cullen about Labour's strategy to win this year's election and what they need to prove to the electorate that they deserve that right. Thank you for joining us, the Minister of Finance and Deputy Prime Minister, Dr. Michael Cullen.
Good evening.
Can I start by offering you one of our beautiful Frank drinks?
Thank you. I love an apple juice.
Ginger beer, and I shall have a ginger beer.
Thank you.
I tell you, these are great. It's the best part of the show.
Ah, very good.
Try that and tell me it's not one of the best apple juices you've had.
Very nice.
I'll use that as an ad.
Very nice.
Right, let's get straight into it. Did you swear when Treasury informed you that they had misplaced 600 million?
Strictly speaking, it was IRD that made the mistake, not Treasury. Well, I was pleased that they found the 600 million. I was quite worried when they told me the tax revenue was going down quite quickly. And I didn't really believe the reasons they gave. They didn't seem to me to add up, so I was quite pleased when in fact they found they'd made a quite simple error in IRD.
Right. Let's talk tax cuts in terms of strategy for the election.
Yep.
You've argued from the start, like cricket to the grasshopper, that we needed to save some for a rainy day.
Yep.
Indeed, you were attacked for your chewing gum budget,
Yes.
and you've sort of been accused of being the Grinch that stole the tax cuts.
Yes.
Has the recent turmoil with the possible American recession and the turmoil of the international markets, the American recession, has that in some part justified your decisions?
I think it means the rainy day is probably more likely to be here than was looked to be the case, say, a year or two ago. And the fact that the government's in a strong position fiscally means that we can manage through that period without having to look at sort of cutting back on social spending or cutting super or closing hospitals or whatever may be the case. So we're in a strong position to manage through. The government's underlying surplus is still stronger than we need to maintain over the medium to long term, so we can now look at revenue reduction, tax cuts back to ordinary New Zealanders.
You've said that the real issue when we compare ourselves, as we always do, to Australia isn't so much tax cuts, but low wages.
Yeah.
Isn't the solution then wage rises?
Well, obviously over the long term we want to see strong wage and salary growth. There's a bit of chicken and egg here. One of the reasons we've got this gap between our two economies, which grew up in the 1980s and 1990s, you go back 20 odd years, we didn't have this big wage gap between Australia and New Zealand. They've been putting a lot more investment into their economy. In technical language, they're more capital intensive, so their productivity is higher, so they can afford to pay higher wages and salaries. And for a long time, from the mid-80s through to the end of the 1990s, we had this strategy of let's reduce costs. Let's try and sort of keep wages under control, cut them down, reduce conditions with the Employment Contracts Act. In the meantime, Australian wages and salaries were growing strongly, and that investment was occurring. Now, we've managed to stabilise that. We haven't dropped further behind over the last 8.5 years. We've kept pace with Australia, both in terms of economic growth and in terms of gross wages and salaries. It's going to be a hard job to catch up, and it's going to take quite a long time because we're talking about catching up with one of the most successful economies in the developed world, which is being fuelled by the minerals boom, the demands from China and India for iron ore and gas and all the rest of the things that Australia produces in great abundance.
Why hasn't this been the focus of the media debate then? I mean, in your argument with Guy, you suggested vested interests stoked the tax cut debate. But National's promise of more personal money in your personal pocket, that's a hard desire to argue with, isn't it?
Well, I think one of the problems we had around all the explanation was trying to explain what an operating surplus was anyway, and people saw this vast operating surplus and thought we could spend all of that on tax cuts. Why is Cullen dragging this money off me when he's got this great pile of money building up?
Why are you doing that?
Well, one of the things that happened over the last 3 years is that we kept forecasting the economy to slow. In fact, the economy kept moving along at a fairly cracking pace. So we've been taking in more revenue than we expected to do each year. So we kept forecasting getting to where we needed to be and actually kept overperforming. That means we now actually do have some cash on hand. And as we move into this tax cuts phase over the next 2 or 3 years, that cash on hand will be run down and we'll get back to the kind of balanced position around debt that we were looking for. So we'll see gross debt remaining about the same. We'll see net debt running down a bit because we'll be drawing down on that cash.
But you know what people are saying, you know what people are thinking. You're giving us tax cuts because it's an election year and you're losing in the polls.
Well, in fact, of course, one of the issues will be when those tax cuts begin. They may well not begin until 1 April next year.
But they may well begin on 1 October next year, therefore kind of stymieing National's ability to do tax cuts, because they're either going to have to say, well, we'll remove that tax cut and then do our own tax cut or whatever. So which one will it be?
Well, whether or not it's 1 October or 1 April, we will legislate for those changes this side of the election.
Do you think it'll be 1 October or 1 April?
We will legislate for those changes. I can't make that judgment until I've got the final forecast from Treasury until my colleagues have considered those forecasts.
Which would you like it to be?
We've set certain tests. I'm actually quite neutral around that.
Really?
Well, there's some, if you look at it in terms of political strategy, there are arguments both ways. People get the money in the hand if it's before the election. On the other hand, once they've done that, people bank it and move on to the next issue. One of the great truths of politics is you don't get great thanks for what you have done. People are looking forward to what you're going to do next.
But you're very good at stymieing the opposition, you know, from behind the trenches when they least expect it. And it would seem to me that by doing having something that comes out on the 1st of October is going to cause National great.
Well, maybe, except you look what happened in Australia in last year's election, where the then government actually gave these $500 rebates directly to people between the budget and the election. And if anything, I think it actually did them damage. The Labor Party went into the election in Australia promising somewhat less than the government was doing in terms of expenditure and revenue reduction, and won the election.
So you're trying to do that in the opposite way?
Well, we've now got National very clearly saying it doesn't matter what tax cuts we announce, they'll offer more.
Yeah.
So it's not so they've said this is what we'll offer. They've said we'll wait to see what the government's doing, then we'll offer more no matter what it is. And so we've said, well, look, there's got to be other considerations. We don't want mortgage interest rates rising further because the tax cuts have been feeding too much demand. We don't want to be cutting social services because we don't want to see tax cuts squeezing out health and education.
So in a strange way, you're hoping that the Nationals' tax cut policy is far greater than yours.
I think there's a real situation here where National is getting itself blocked into a corner if it's not careful. Effectively saying we don't care about the social services and we don't care about interest rates and we don't care about issues of equality and so on. We don't care about increasing debt over the long term. As long as there's been enough tax cut, we'll try and win the election, then we'll solve the problems afterwards. Now, of course, that's what led to problems in the past, where governments made promises sustainable, covered up agendas, did a U-turn after the election, and then, of course, people's confidence in the government collapsed. That's how we got the current electoral system, was the people punishing successive Labor and National governments for doing precisely that. And this Labor government has been very, very clear about doing what it said before the election we would do, not having hidden agendas in that way.
Let's talk about